Stand at the edge of a puddling furnace in 1858, and the first thing you notice is not the heat. It is the light, a white-orange glow so intense that it burns through your eyelids even when you close them. The air itself feels solid, pressing against your chest like a hot hand. And somewhere in that blinding inferno, a man is standing with a 20-foot iron rod, stirring 500 pounds of molten metal like he is making the devil's oatmeal. His name does not appear in any history book. No photograph exists of his face. But every mile of railroad track that connected the American continent before 1870 passed through his hands, through his furnace, through the 12-hour shifts that would eventually steal his eyesight, his lungs, and in many cases, his life. Before Andrew Carnegie, before Bessemer Steel, before the industrial processes that made mass production possible, there was this: men standing at the mouth of hell, wrestling iron into submission one batch at a time, and they did it 60,000 times over. 60,000 miles of track, hammered and rolled and finished by hand. This is the story of the puddlers, the most physically demanding job in American industrial history. The men who literally forged the rails that built a nation and were then forgotten the moment they stepped away from the furnace. You have ridden on their work, you have benefited from their sacrifice, and until today, you probably did not know they existed. To understand what these men accomplished, you first need to understand what iron actually is, and more importantly, what it is not. Iron ore comes out of the ground as rock, useless rock. It contains iron, but that iron is locked inside a chemical prison of oxygen and carbon and silicon and sulfur. To get the iron out, you need heat, tremendous heat, heat that humans could not reliably produce until the development of the blast furnace. A blast furnace is exactly what it sounds like: a towering structure, sometimes 60 feet tall, where iron ore is mixed with charcoal or coke and limestone, then subjected to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the iron separates from the rock. It melts. It flows. It collects at the bottom of the furnace as a glowing liquid that workers tap off into sand molds. This is pig iron, named for the shape of those sand molds, which branch off from a central channel like piglets nursing from a sow. Pig iron is brittle. It contains 4 to 5% carbon, which makes it hard but also makes it crack under stress. You cannot bend pig iron. You cannot shape it. Hit it with a hammer and it shatters. Pig iron is useless for railroad track. A train would crack it on the first pass. What railroads needed was wrought iron. Iron with almost no carbon. Iron that could flex without breaking. That could absorb the constant pounding of locomotive wheels. That could be shaped and rolled and finished into the precise profiles that railroad engineers demanded. But here is the problem. You cannot simply heat pig iron until the carbon disappears. Carbon does not work that way. It is chemically bonded to the iron at the molecular level. To remove it, you need to oxidize it. You need to expose the molten iron to air while keeping it hot enough to remain workable. You need a puddling furnace. The puddling furnace was invented in England in 1784 by a man named Henry Cort. It was the first technology in human history that could produce wrought iron in industrial quantities. And for 70 years, until the Bessemer process made it obsolete, every ton of quality iron used in construction, manufacturing, and transportation came out of a puddling furnace. Picture a brick structure about the size of a small room. One end contains a firebox where coal burns at maximum intensity. The other end contains a shallow basin lined with iron oxide, called the hearth. A low wall separates the fire from the hearth, but heat and flame roll over this wall continuously, keeping the hearth at temperatures between 2,500 and 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This is called a reverberatory furnace because the heat reverberates off the arch ceiling and back down onto the material being worked. The design keeps the coal and its impurities separated from the iron, while still delivering enough thermal energy to keep the iron in a semi-molten state. Now here is where the human being enters the equation. A worker called a puddler stands at a small opening in the side of the furnace. Through this opening, he inserts a long iron rod called a rabble. The rabble can be 15 to 20 feet long, and it weighs 30 to 40 pounds. At the far end, inside the furnace, 500 pounds of pig iron sits in the hearth, glowing white hot and beginning to melt. The puddler's job is to stir, not gently, not occasionally, constantly, aggressively, for hours at a time. As the iron heats, it becomes pasty, sticky. The puddler must work the rabble through this paste, folding and turning and exposing fresh surfaces to the flame. Each time new iron contacts the air and the iron oxide lining, carbon burns off as carbon dioxide. The iron gets purer, but it also gets stiffer, thicker, harder to move. A puddler in the mid-19th century stirred that rabble an estimated 15,000 times per shift. 15,000 controlled movements of a 40-pound rod through material that would melt flesh on contact. And he did it while standing 3 feet from a furnace, putting out enough infrared radiation to cause permanent eye damage. This was not a job. It was a physical ordeal that most human bodies simply could not sustain. The men who worked these furnaces were not randomly selected. They were bred for it. Sometimes, literally. Puddling was a trade that passed from father to son because the skills required could not be taught in any school. You had to learn by watching, by feeling, by developing an intuition for when the iron was ready that no thermometer could provide. A master puddler could tell the temperature of his charge by the color of the glow. White-orange meant ready to work. Cherry red meant losing heat. Any shade of blue meant the batch was ruined, overheated to the point where the iron had begun to burn rather than purify. He could tell the carbon content by how the iron moved, by its texture, by the way it responded to his rabble. This knowledge took years to acquire. A boy might enter the puddling shed at 12 or 13 years old, working as a helper, fetching tools and clearing debris. By 16, he might be trusted to assist with charging the furnace. By 18 or 20, if he had the strength and the aptitude, he might begin learning to work the rabble himself. Full mastery came only in the mid-20s, after a decade of watching and practicing and absorbing the countless small judgments that separated good iron from bad. But the physical demands went far beyond skill. A puddler worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. During those 12 hours, he might process 4 to 6 batches of iron called heats. Each heat required 90 minutes to 2 hours of continuous stirring. The temperature at his workstation regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiant heat from the furnace opening was intense enough to blister exposed skin within minutes. Puddlers wore thick leather aprons and heavy gloves, but these provided minimal protection. They wrapped their faces in wet rags that dried out within 10 minutes. They drank enormous quantities of water, losing it almost immediately through sweat. A puddler could lose 10 to 15 pounds of body weight during a single shift, all of it water. The physical toll compounded over time. A puddler at 25 was in his prime. By 35, his strength was noticeably diminished. By 45, if he had survived that long, his body was a wreck. Stooped shoulders from years of working the rabble, chronic pain in every joint, lungs scarred by decades of breathing coal smoke and iron dust. And then there were the injuries. Burns were so common they barely warranted mention. Splashes of molten iron, contact with hot tools, accidental touches against furnace surfaces. Every puddler carried scars. The question was only how many and how severe. Some men bore burns that had healed into thick ropes of scar tissue, their skin remapped by the geography of their trade. More serious were the ruptures. Hernias from the constant exertion of working the rabble, torn muscles in the shoulders, back, and abdomen, joint damage that accumulated over years until a man could barely raise his arms above his waist. These injuries ended careers. A puddler who could not work the rabble was worthless to his employer. There was no disability insurance, no workers' compensation. A man who broke down simply stopped earning, and his family suffered the consequences. But the injury that defined the profession, the one that marked puddlers as a class apart from other industrial workers, was blindness. Puddlers' cataracts, as the doctors called it, caused by prolonged exposure to infrared radiation from the furnace opening. The symptoms started with blurred vision, halos around lights, difficulty seeing in low illumination. Over time, the lens of the eye became clouded, milky, opaque. By their 40s, most puddlers could not read. By their 50s, many could not see their own children's faces. There was no treatment. There was no prevention. The only protection would have been to look away from the furnace, and a puddler who looked away could not do his job. He had to watch the iron constantly, judging its color and consistency with every passing minute. The very act of doing his work was destroying his sight. Medical journals of the period documented the phenomenon with clinical detachment. Infrared radiation, invisible to the eye but felt as heat on the skin, penetrated the lens and slowly cooked the proteins inside. The damage was cumulative and irreversible. A puddler did not go blind all at once. He went blind gradually, year by year, until one day he realized he could no longer see the iron he had spent his life working. They went blind so that America could have its railroads, and not a single monument commemorates this sacrifice. Let us follow a single rail from beginning to end, from the moment iron ore enters the blast furnace to the moment that finished rail is spiked to a tie somewhere on the expanding American frontier. The blast furnace runs continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time. Workers called fillers carry loads of ore, coke, and limestone up long ramps to the furnace top, dumping their burdens into the fire over and over again. It is brutal work, but it is not skilled work. These are the lowest paid laborers at the ironworks, and their bodies break down faster than anyone else's. The ramps could be 100 feet long, winding up the side of the furnace structure. A filler might climb that ramp 50 times in a shift, carrying 60 to 80 pounds on each trip. His legs burned with exhaustion. His lungs struggled for air in the heat and smoke, and if he stumbled, if he fell, the consequences could be fatal. Falls from the furnace ramps kill dozens of workers every year across American ironworks. At the bottom of the furnace, other workers called keepers monitor the accumulation of molten iron. When enough is collected, they open a tap hole in the furnace wall, and liquid iron flows out in a glowing stream, channeling into those sand molds that will form the pigs. The heat is extraordinary. The keepers stand as far back as their tools allow, but still they suffer burns. Still they breathe air that has passed over molten metal. The tapping itself was a delicate operation. If the tap hole was not properly prepared, if the iron contained too much slag, if anything went wrong, molten metal could spray in unexpected directions. Keepers wore heavy protective clothing, but no protection was absolute. Men died at the tap hole, burned by iron that found its way through gaps in their armor. The pigs cool overnight. The next morning, they are broken out of their molds and carried to the puddling furnaces. Here is where the transformation begins. A typical ironworks might have 20 or 30 puddling furnaces operating simultaneously. The sound is indescribable. Roaring fires, clanging metal, the grunt and shout of men working at the edge of human endurance. Smoke and steam fill the building, mixing with coal dust and iron particles until the air itself becomes a physical presence, something you push through rather than breathe. The puddler charges his furnace with 400 to 500 pounds of pig iron. He watches it soften, watches the surface begin to shimmer with escaping gases. Then he takes up his rabble and begins to work. 90 minutes of stirring, 90 minutes of turning and folding and exposing fresh iron to the purifying flame. The iron passes through stages. First thin and runny, then thick and pasty, then lumpy as carbon burns away and the melting point rises. By the end, the puddler is working something that resembles wet concrete, stiff and heavy and resistant to every movement. When the iron reaches the right consistency, when the puddler judges that enough carbon has been removed, he divides the mass into balls weighing roughly 80 to 100 pounds each. These balls are called blooms. They glow white hot, soft enough to shape, but solid enough to handle with tongs. The blooms must be worked immediately. If they cool, they become unworkable. A helper grabs each bloom with heavy tongs and rushes it to the shingling hammer. The shingling hammer is a mechanical beast. A massive hammerhead, sometimes weighing 1,000 pounds, raised and dropped by steam power or water power, pounding the bloom against an anvil in rapid succession. The purpose is to expel slag, those impurities that remain trapped inside the iron. Each blow sends sparks flying in all directions. The worker holding the bloom must rotate it between strikes, ensuring even compression, while standing close enough to feel every impact shudder through his arms. The violence of the shingling hammer cannot be overstated. Each blow landed with the force of a small explosion. The worker holding the bloom felt the impact through every bone in his body. Over time, this constant vibration damaged nerves and joints. Hammermen developed a characteristic shake in their hands, a tremor that marked their trade as surely as the puddler's blindness marked his. After shingling, the bloom goes to the rolling mill. Rolling mills were the other half of the equation. If puddling furnaces converted pig iron to wrought iron, rolling mills shaped that iron into useful forms. And the most important form of all was the railroad rail. Picture an enormous building filled with machinery, lines of massive iron rollers arranged in pairs, each pair set closer together than the last. The rollers are driven by steam engines, spinning continuously, waiting to receive their offerings of red-hot iron. A bloom arrives from the shingling hammer, still glowing, still pliable. Workers use long tongs to feed it between the first pair of rollers. The rollers grab the iron and pull it through, compressing it, elongating it, squeezing it into a rough rectangular shape. The iron emerges faster than it entered, longer and thinner than before. The workers catch it with their tongs and feed it to the next pair of rollers. Tighter compression, further elongation. The iron is moving fast now, sometimes 15 or 20 feet per second. One mistake, one slip of the tongs, and the red-hot bar becomes a whip that can kill. The rolling mill was a place of constant motion and constant danger. The men who worked there developed an almost supernatural coordination, knowing exactly when to grab, when to release, when to step back. They communicated through shouts and gestures, their voices lost in the roar of machinery. A new worker in the rolling mill was a liability. It took months, sometimes years, to develop the reflexes necessary to survive. Roll after roll, pass after pass, the iron transforms from a lumpy bloom to a long bar. From a square cross-section to the distinctive T-shape of a railroad rail. Each pass requires perfect timing, perfect coordination between the workers feeding the rolls and those catching the output. By the final pass, the iron has been compressed, stretched, and shaped into a rail 15 to 30 feet long. It is still hot, still glowing a dull red, but its form is complete. Workers drag it to cooling beds where it will spend hours releasing its heat to the air, and then come the finishers. These are the craftsmen who ensure that each rail meets specification. They examine the surface for cracks and flaws. They check the profile against templates to verify that the shape is correct. They drill holes at precise locations where the rail will be bolted to joint bars. They stamp each rail with the ironworks mark and the date of manufacture. A skilled finisher could spot imperfections invisible to untrained eyes. A hairline crack that would cause the rail to fail under load. A slight deviation in profile that would prevent proper seating in the chairs and joint bars. These men were the last line of quality control, and their judgment could mean the difference between a functioning railroad and a deadly accident. Only after passing all inspections does the rail join the stack waiting for shipment, loaded onto rail cars, transported to construction sites, laid by track gangs who have no idea how many men suffered to produce the metal beneath their hammers. From ore to finished rail, the journey required dozens of workers across multiple trades, fillers and keepers at the blast furnace, puddlers and their helpers at the reverberatory furnaces, hammermen at the shingling station, rollers and catchers at the mills, finishers and inspectors at the end of the line. Every one of them left something behind in that ironworks. Health, time, sometimes life itself. And every mile of railroad track represents their accumulated sacrifice. Now let us talk about scale. Because what makes this story extraordinary is not just the difficulty of the work, but the sheer volume of output these men achieved. In 1860, American ironworks produced approximately 200,000 tons of railroad rails. 200,000 tons. At an average weight of about 28 pounds per yard of track, that is enough rail to lay roughly 14,000 miles of new railroad in a single year. Think about what that number means in terms of human labor. Each ton of finished rail required approximately 2 tons of pig iron, because puddling and rolling both produce waste. Each ton of pig iron required approximately 2 tons of iron ore, plus coke and limestone for the blast furnace. The math cascades backward through the production chain. To produce 200,000 tons of rails, American puddlers worked roughly 400,000 tons of pig iron. That is 400,000 heats at their furnaces. 400,000 90-minute sessions of stirring molten metal at the edge of human endurance. If each puddler completed 4 heats per shift, that is 100,000 12-hour shifts of puddling labor for 1 year of rail production in one country. During an era when the railroad network was still far from complete. Consider that number again. 100,000 shifts. If a single puddler worked 300 shifts per year, which was typical, that represents the labor of more than 300 puddlers working full-time for an entire year, just for the puddling stage. The blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the finishing operations all required additional workers. By 1870, the United States had laid over 60,000 miles of railroad track, much of it with iron rails. Much of those rails produced in ironworks clustered around cities like Pittsburgh, Bethlehem, Johnstown, and Cleveland. The Cambria Iron Works in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, alone employed over 4,000 workers at its peak. Bethlehem Iron Company would grow into Bethlehem Steel, one of the largest industrial enterprises in American history. These ironworks did not exist in isolation. They created entire communities around them. Towns grew up in the shadow of blast furnaces, their populations tied completely to the fate of the iron industry. Workers lived in company housing, bought goods at company stores, sent their children to schools built by the ironworks. Their lives revolved around the shift whistle and the furnace schedule. In Johnstown, the Cambria Works dominated everything. The smoke from its furnaces hung over the valley like a permanent weather system. The noise of its operations could be heard miles away. The men who worked there were the town's aristocracy, their wages supporting every shop and saloon and church in the community. When the works prospered, Johnstown prospered. When the works struggled, the whole town felt the pain. This was the reality of industrial America in the mid-19th century. Capital and labor bound together in relationships that were as much about geography and community as they were about economics. A puddler did not simply have a job. He had a place in a social order that depended on his continued ability to work. But in the 1850s and 1860s, these were still ironworks, still dependent on puddling furnaces and muscular labor, still converting pig iron to wrought iron one batch at a time, one man at a time, one ruined body at a time. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. It represents a level of organized human suffering that we have largely erased from our understanding of industrial progress. The irony of wrought iron rails is that they wore out remarkably fast. A busy main line might destroy a rail in 2 to 3 years. Branch lines with lighter traffic might get 5 years from a rail before it needed replacement. Either way, the railroads faced a never-ending demand for new iron. This was not a flaw in the manufacturing. It was a fundamental limitation of the material. Wrought iron, for all its advantages over cast iron, simply could not withstand the repeated stress of heavy locomotives and loaded freight cars. The surface work-hardened under impact, becoming brittle. Cracks formed, spread, until eventually the rail failed, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes catastrophically. Rail failures cause derailments. Derailments cause deaths. The history of American railroading before steel is littered with accidents that trace back to fatigued iron rails snapping under load. Newspapers of the period reported these accidents with alarming regularity. A train leaving the tracks, cars tumbling into ravines, passengers killed or maimed, and somewhere in the wreckage, a broken rail cracked clean through where metal fatigue had finally won. The human cost of these failures is difficult to calculate. Thousands of people died in railroad accidents during the iron rail era. Not all of those deaths were caused by rail failure, of course. Collisions, derailments from other causes, boiler explosions on locomotives, but a significant portion can be traced back to the fundamental weakness of wrought iron under repeated stress. And yet, no one blamed the puddlers. No one questioned whether better iron might have been possible. The technology was understood. The limitations were known. What no one wanted to acknowledge was that the economic imperatives of railroad expansion had created a system that accepted a certain level of fatal accidents as the cost of doing business. The railroads investigated these accidents, of course. They documented the failure modes. They understood that their rails were wearing out, but they had no alternative. Iron was the only material that could be produced in sufficient quantity at acceptable cost. Steel existed, but steel production before Bessemer was even more labor-intensive than iron production, reserved for specialty applications like tools and weapons. And yet the railroads kept building, kept demanding more rails, kept pushing the ironworks to produce faster, cheaper, more. Because the economic pressure was relentless. Every mile of new track opened new territory to commerce. Every day of delay cost money. The railroads did not care how many puddlers went blind. They needed their rails. At a cost of $40 to $60 per ton, iron rails represented an enormous capital expense for railroad companies. A single mile of track required roughly 100 tons of rail, meaning $4,000 to $6,000 just for the iron, before ties and spikes and labor and right-of-way. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, cost over $100 million in total, a significant portion of which went to ironworks producing the rails. That money paid for the furnaces and the rolling mills. It paid for the coal and the ore. And somewhere at the bottom of the accounting, it paid for the men, the puddlers and rollers and finishers whose labor converted raw materials into finished product. They were paid by the ton, by the heat, by the shift, and when their bodies gave out, they were replaced by new men waiting for their chance at the furnace. Let us spend a moment at Cambria Iron Works. It is 1867. The works sprawl across the valley floor at Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a complex of blast furnaces and puddling sheds and rolling mills that represents one of the largest iron-producing operations in the world. The morning shift begins at 6. Workers stream through the gates in the gray pre-dawn light, hundreds of men heading to their assigned stations. Some are already coughing, the coal dust and iron particles of previous shifts still lodged in their lungs. Others walk with the stiff gait of old injuries, bodies that have been broken and imperfectly healed. In the puddling shed, the furnaces have been running all night. The night shift hands off to the day shift in a brief exchange of information. This furnace is running hot. That one needs attention to its lining. The pig iron supply is low. Expect delays. A puddler named Thomas takes his position. He is 34 years old, though he looks 50. His forearms are a map of burn scars. His eyes squint constantly, the early signs of cataracts already affecting his vision. He has worked at Cambria for 16 years, starting as a helper at 18, earning his place at the furnace at 23. Thomas knows every inch of his furnace. He knows how it breathes, how it responds to different batches of pig iron, how the heat shifts through the day as the firebox consumes its fuel. This knowledge is his livelihood, the accumulated wisdom of more than a decade standing at this same opening, and working this same rabble, watching this same fire. Thomas charges his furnace with the first batch of pig iron, 500 pounds shoveled in through the charging door in a cascade of gray metal. He closes the door and waits. Watches through the small viewing port as the iron begins to heat. 20 minutes pass. The iron surface shimmers and begins to soften. Thomas takes up his rabble, inserts it through the working hole, and begins to stir. For the next 90 minutes, he will not stop. He cannot stop. The iron demands constant attention. If he pauses, the batch cools unevenly. If he works too aggressively, he risks splashing molten metal through the working hole. If he misjudges the temperature or the carbon content, he ruins the heat and costs his employer money. The rabble grows heavier with each passing minute. His shoulders burn. His back screams. Sweat pours down his face, evaporating before it can drip from his chin. The heat radiating from the furnace opening is a physical force, pressing against him, trying to push him back. But Thomas does not step back. He cannot step back. This is his trade, his livelihood, the only skill he possesses in a world that values skilled labor above all else. Without this furnace, he is nothing. a broken man with no future and no prospects. So he stirs and stirs and stirs. By noon, he has completed 3 heats. His arms tremble with exhaustion. His vision blurs from the constant exposure to infrared light. He eats his lunch standing up, unwilling to sit, because he fears he might not rise again. The lunch itself is meager: bread and cheese and cold water. Nothing heavy, and nothing that would slow him down when he returns to the furnace. The other puddlers eat in silence, conserving their energy for the afternoon. They have nothing to say to each other that they have not said 1,000 times before. They share a profession and a fate, and that is bond enough. By evening, he has completed 6 heats, 3,000 pounds of pig iron converted to blooms, sent to the shingling hammer, rolled into rails that will carry trains across a continent he will never see. Thomas walks home in the gathering darkness. His wife does not ask how his day was. She knows. She can see it in the way he moves, in the vacancy behind his eyes, in the new burns on his hands that he did not bother to mention. He will be back at the furnace tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for as long as his body holds together. This is what built America. This is what no one remembers. The Bessemer process changed everything. Patented in 1856 by Henry Bessemer in England, it offered a way to convert pig iron to steel, not wrought iron, but actual steel, in a matter of minutes rather than hours. No stirring, no rabble, no puddler standing at the mouth of hell. The Bessemer converter was a revolution. A large pear-shaped vessel that could be tilted to receive a charge of molten pig iron, then blasted with air forced through the bottom. The air oxidized the carbon directly, burning it off in a spectacular display of flame and sparks that terrified observers when they first witnessed it. A Bessemer converter could process 5 tons of iron in 15 to 20 minutes. A puddling furnace might process 500 pounds in 90 minutes. The math was devastating. One converter could replace dozens of puddlers, and the product was superior. Steel was harder than wrought iron, more durable, longer lasting. Steel rails might survive 20 or 30 years where iron rails failed in 3. The economics were irresistible. A railroad that had to replace its track every 3 to 5 years could suddenly lay rails that would last a generation. The cost savings compounded over time. Within a decade of the first successful American Bessemer operations, steel had become the material of choice for new construction. American ironworks began adopting the Bessemer process in the late 1860s. By the 1870s, steel production was ramping up. By the 1880s, the puddling furnace was obsolete. A technology that had dominated iron-making for nearly a century vanished within a generation. And with it, vanished the puddlers. Some transitioned to other work within the mills. Some found employment in industries that still used wrought iron for specialized purposes. But many simply disappeared from the workforce, their skills suddenly worthless, their bodies already broken by years of labor that no longer had value. They left behind no union strong enough to protect them, no pension system to support their retirement, no medical infrastructure to treat the cataracts and lung diseases and cumulative injuries they had accumulated. They were used up and discarded, like the worn-out rails they had helped produce. The Pittsburgh Gazette in 1885 noted that former puddlers could be found begging on street corners, blind and infirm, their contribution to American industry forgotten. The same newspaper had celebrated rail production records just 20 years earlier. This was the fate that awaited men who had given their best years to an industry that no longer needed them. Their sons might find work in the new steel mills, but the skills of puddling were useless in a Bessemer converter. The knowledge they had accumulated, the intuition they had developed, the mastery they had achieved through years of suffering, all of it became worthless overnight. The rails themselves had a second life. Iron rails, once removed from active service, did not disappear. They were melted down and repuddled, converted into new iron products. Or they were sold to secondary railroads, branch lines, and narrow-gauge operations that could not afford new steel. Or they were shipped overseas. To countries still building their own rail networks. Some iron rails ended up in South America, some in Asia, some in Africa. The rails that had carried American trains in the 1860s might have carried colonial trains in the 1890s, connecting mines to ports, plantations to shipping terminals, resources to the empires that extracted them. In a sense, the puddlers' work echoed across the world long after they were gone. The iron they made with their hands traveled farther than any of them ever would, but the most lasting echo was the one they could not see: the transformation of America from a scattered collection of regional economies into a unified national market. The ability to move goods from coast to coast in days rather than months. The integration of agriculture and industry that made the United States the world's leading economic power by the early 20th century. None of that happens without the railroads. And the railroads do not happen without the rails. 60,000 miles of track before 1870. 60,000 miles hammered and rolled and finished by hand. Enough iron to circle the earth more than twice. And behind every yard of that iron, a man at a furnace stirring molten metal, going blind so that you could live in a connected world. I want you to try something. Find a piece of old railroad track, a section of rail from a museum display perhaps, or a decorative piece at some historic site. Look at it closely. Run your hand along the surface. That rail was not stamped out by a machine. It was shaped by human hands, heated by human labor, finished by human eyes that could still see when the work began and could not see when it ended. The rails that built America were forged in fire and paid for in blood. Every spike driven into a tie connected to a chain of labor that stretched back through rolling mills and puddling furnaces and blast furnaces and ore mines, each link composed of men whose names we do not know and never will. We talk about the golden spike at Promontory Summit, the famous photograph of locomotive pilots touching, the speeches and celebrations that marked the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. We do not talk about the puddlers, the rollers, the finishers, the helpers who rushed white-hot blooms from furnace to hammer to mill, the fillers who climbed the blast furnace ramps with loads of ore and coke until their legs gave out. They are gone now, all of them. The last puddler died generations ago, probably blind, probably poor, probably wondering whether anyone would remember what he had done. This is your chance to remember, not with monuments or holidays, those things are for politicians and generals, but with understanding, with acknowledgement, with a moment of recognition that the world you live in was built by people who suffered for it. 60,000 miles of railroad track, 400,000 heats of iron, hundreds of thousands of shifts at furnaces that would steal their sight, countless burns and ruptures and broken bodies. That is the cost of progress. That is the debt we owe and can never repay. The next time you see a train, think of them, the iron men, the puddlers, the workers who forged America's railroads by hand, and then were forgotten the moment steel made them obsolete. They deserve to be remembered. And now, at least, you know they existed. If this is the first video of mine you have watched, I explore stories like this every week. The forgotten labor that built the modern world, the workers who sacrificed everything for progress and received nothing in return. Subscribe if you want to understand the true cost of the things we take for granted. I will see you in the next one.